For this part of the lecture, we will talk about impression management. Impression management refers to our attempt to get others to see us in the way that we want to be seen. Now, while this might make you think of politicians, which, yes, they're definitely largely concerned about their impressions and actually pay people tremendous sums of money to manage their impressions, the truth is, almost all of us are, at least to some degree, concerned with how others perceive us, and thus we try to manage those perceptions that others have of us. This is ultimately just very common with human beings. One form in which we get people to view us in a more positive light is called ingratiation, and this refers to the process whereby people flatter, praise, and generally try to make themselves likable or useful to another person, and it often applies to someone of higher status than we are. It should be noted that if a person to whom this behavior is directed feels that the behavior is insincere, ultimately is the person who is ingratiating lying to the person, then this can backfire pretty severely, making the person of higher status dislike them even more than if they had just not done any of the quote-unquote kiss-assy behavior beforehand. Now, while this is often viewed quite negatively, it can be a very effective way to get people to view us in a more positive light, and it can work quite well in many contexts. Even those of us who are, shall we say, sensitive towards this can often fall victim of this type of behavior, because many of us at the end of the day very much like to hear good things about ourselves. Another form in which we manage other people's perceptions of us is referred to as self-handicapping. And this refers to the strategy whereby people create obstacles and excuses for themselves so that if they do poorly on a task, they can avoid blaming themselves and blame something else. Now, two general forms of this. The first is behavioral self-handicapping, and this refers to when people act in ways that reduce the likelihood that they will succeed on a task, so that if they fail, they can blame it on one of the obstacles they created themselves rather than their own lack of ability. So an example of this would be if you have an exam tomorrow that you're stressed about, that you go out to the bars, you drink until 4 in the morning, and you come home and then you play some video games and smoke some joints with some of your friends until 5, 6, hell, 8 in the morning, at which case you go and chug a bunch of coffee and then show up for the exam happily, well, not happily, but telling other people who pulled an all-nighter, did all this, did all that, and I don't know, we'll see how this goes. That way, even if you do really poorly, it's easy to blame that excuse on the all-nighter itself rather than any lack of ability. And by some chance, if one does really well, then one can make one's own self look even better, because then in spite of those hurdles, you did pretty well. Now, this is a pretty severe form of self-handicapping, and it doesn't happen as much as the next form we'll talk about, but nonetheless, it does happen. The second form of self-handicapping is reported self-handicapping, and this refers to when people devise ready-made excuses in case they might fail at something. I wasn't feeling well, or I had family in town, or just something to that effect, even if it's not actually the case. I mean, it could be the case, but oftentimes when we're referring to self-handicapping, you're, well, not necessarily being the most honest, let me say. Now, while reported self-handicapping is less directly damaging than behavioral self-handicapping, one of the biggest problems with this form is that people can come to believe their excuses and thus exert less effort, on the tasks at which they could potentially fail at, and this increases the likelihood that they will fail at these tasks. And now this can perpetuate a pretty insidious loop, because as one fails at these tasks, one's self-confidence around them tends to degrade, one's motivation to continue to do well goes down, and so one is likely to create more excuses for the next time you're in situations where you have to perform in this manner, and now those additional excuses become also beliefs, leading to less effort, and this can lead to a cyclical pattern, very similar to what we saw with self-fulfilling prophecies. guess why not just stick this in here? Many of you might not believe me when I say this, but it is okay to fail and make mistakes. For the most part, our failures do not result in the world ending. Hell, for the most part, our failures don't even result in us ending. In many cases, we are able to come back and start over and try again, even though for some reason many people seem to believe that failure equates with the end of something. It is really only the end once you've given up. And if you continue to try, you might not get exactly where you originally intended to go, but you won't go anywhere if you don't try. And if you give up after every time you fail, chances are you won't make it very far, because most of us fail a lot in life. That's just how it works. There is no magical gold stone tablet that decrees that some of us will live a perfectly charmed life in which there is no failure whatsoever. Yes, by quirks of fate or universal randomness, regardless of which camp you fall in, some people will have an easier time than others, but pretty much no one will ever have a perfect ride. If you want one universal truth, it's that no one survives life. Everybody will get scathed to some degree. That's just how it works. Please, please, if there's one thing you internalize from all of this semester of me just talking to a computer and through that computer to you, is that it is okay to make mistakes. Mistakes are how we learn. From those, you can get stronger. If you just are so terrified of making mistakes, chances are you won't try new things and you won't expand your own horizons, and you will just stay in the tiny fish pond in which you're comfortable living. And at the end of the day, if that is your jam, then that is your jam, and who am I to tell you otherwise?